You know that feeling. You spend maybe a Sunday afternoon with family people you actually care about, and you leave just feeling utterly drained, or maybe you're frustrated,
Yeah.
and you can't quite put your finger on why. It's surprisingly common, actually.
Hmm.
And often it really boils down to these like invisible lines in our relationship,
Yeah.
our boundaries, or maybe the lack of them.
Exactly. And what happens when those get crossed?
Right.
So in this deep dive, we're going to, explore the complexities of family boundaries, especially when those lines get tested or nudged or sometimes just flat out ignored.
Yeah.
And we'll be drawing on insights from experts in psychology, but also real life experiences, stuff people have shared navigating these exact challenges.
Okay. So to really dig into this, we've looked at some pretty fascinating stuff. There's Dr. Ofer Zur's work on therapeutic boundaries
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
and a really insightful discussion that happened on Reddit, actually,
Yeah.
about setting limits when, cutting family off just isn't an option.
Right, which is the reality for many people.
Totally. And then there are explorations of toxic family dynamics, this idea of enmeshment from places like Psych Central and Savant Care.
And we've also looked at research on the impact of, let's say, toxic parenting styles on how kids develop.
Okay. But the goal here isn't just to say, walk away, is it?
No, definitely not. Our aim isn't about cutting family off. It's more about understanding how you can create healthier dynamics, healthier interactions, and really protect your own well-being within the relationships you have.
Okay.
So we'll unpack the difference between, say, healthy boundaries and maybe rigid walls, and really importantly, share some practical strategies, things you can actually try.
Okay, let's unpack that word then. Boundaries. We keep saying it, but what are we really talking about?
Well, fundamentally, boundaries are the limits, the rules, you could say, that you set in your relationships.
Okay.
They basically define what treatment, what behaviors are acceptable to you. Savant Care and others point out they help you define your personal space, physical and emotional space. They help you articulate your needs and sort of set expectations for how you want people to treat you with respect. Think of them like the rules of engagement for your relationships.
That makes sense.
Right.
Having a clear sense of what's okay and being able to say it. Now, you mentioned Dr. Zur talks about boundary crossings versus violations in therapy. How does that apply to family?
Yeah, that's a really useful distinction. So in therapy, Zur points out that ethics codes don't forbid all crossings. Like maybe a therapist offers a brief, comforting touch in a crisis or accepts a very small gift. That's a crossing.
Okay.
It's the violations actions that are exploitative that actually harm the client. Those are the big ethical no-nos.
Right.
Now, applying that to family, think of a crossing as maybe someone offering unsolicited advice when you just wanted them to listen. A bit annoying, maybe, but perhaps not intentionally harmful.
Okay, I get that.
A violation, though, that's more like someone consistently ignoring your direct request for privacy, or maybe using guilt trips to manipulate you. That really undermines your autonomy.
So the difference is often intent or impact.
It's often a mix, isn't it? It's about the perceived intent, definitely, but also the power dynamics in the family, the history you have. Does this happen all the time? Does it feel disrespectful? It's less about the single act sometimes and more about the underlying message it sends about your value.
Gotcha. So setting boundaries in a family context is really about protecting that personal space, physical and emotional, so you can feel like yourself.
Exactly. Our sources really emphasize this. Boundaries help establish appropriate roles. Who's responsible for what? Where does my responsibility end and yours begin? They create that necessary space between people, which is just crucial for respect, for autonomy, and for feeling emotionally secure. Without them, it can feel like everyone's just emotionally tangled up.
And why is that so vital? Why are boundaries so incredibly important, especially with family?
Well, particularly if you're dealing with family members whose behavior is, let's say, difficult or even toxic, setting boundaries becomes fundamental. It's self-preservation. Sources like Savant Care really highlight how critical these limits are for protecting your mental health, your overall well-being, your sense of self.
Okay.
Without clear boundaries, you can easily end up feeling overwhelmed, maybe invaded. It leads to stress, resentment builds up, and it can really chip away at your self-worth over time. And interestingly, some research actually points to a link between having healthy boundaries and, well, less stress and more satisfaction in your relationships generally.
Okay. This brings us to that idea of toxic family dynamics. What are some of those, like, real red flags, behaviors that tell you boundaries aren't just nice to have, they're essential?
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty clear picture. Think about things like emotional manipulation,
Right.
guilt trips, playing the victim to control you.
Oh, yeah.
Constant criticism is a big one, where flaws are always pointed out, but achievements are ignored or minimized.
Mm-hmm.
Intrusive behavior, ignoring your need for privacy, prying, feeling entitled to know everything about your life. Then there's that victim mentality we mentioned, always avoiding responsibility, expecting others to fix everything.
Okay.
And of course, more overt stuff like verbal abuse, angry outbursts that seem totally out of proportion, threatening language.
Yeah.
Headspace also mentions the four horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling. Maybe not always outright abuse, but definitely signs of a toxic dynamic that just erodes connection.
You mentioned enmeshment earlier. That sounds like a really key concept here when we talk about family boundaries.
Right.
What exactly is enmeshment?
Right. Enmeshment is a specific family dynamic where the emotional boundaries between people are really blurred or just lacking.
Okay.
As Psych Central describes it, individuals become emotionally fused.
Hmm.
It's not healthy interdependence. It's more like everyone feels everyone else's feelings too intensely.
Like you said, everyone wearing the same emotional sweater.
Exactly. If one person's anxious, everyone feels anxious. Roles get confused, expectations get tangled. There's often this unspoken belief that one person has the right to dictate another's thoughts or feelings, maybe even their identity.
Wow. Okay, so what are the signs then? How would you know if a family dynamic is leaning towards enmeshment?
Well, you often see that real lack of clear emotional and physical boundaries.
Hmm.
People might constantly put others' needs way ahead of their own.
Hmm?
Feeling responsible for everyone else's happiness is a big one. Feeling intense guilt or shame if you want space or if you make choices that don't fit the family mold.
Yeah.
You might see parents whose self-worth seems totally tied up in their kids' success.
Oh, interesting.
Also, maybe oversharing really personal stuff within the family, creating weird dependencies. Parents may be treating kids like confidants, sharing adult problems.
Right, blurring those roles.
Definitely. Difficulty saying no, having a weak sense of who you are outside the family, absorbing others' emotions like a sponge. These are all pretty common signs.
And how does this connect to codependency? We hear that term sometimes too.
Yeah, they often go hand in hand. The source on codependency clarifies they're slightly different, but enmeshment can really create the perfect conditions for codependency to develop.
How so?
Well, think of it like this. Enmeshment fosters that intense emotional reliance. So, in codependency, your own sense of well-being becomes excessively dependent on someone else's mood or approval.
Okay.
The underlying feeling is often something like, because I feel what you feel so strongly, I must be responsible for how you feel, so I can only be okay if you're okay.
Wow, that really clarifies why setting boundaries, especially in these dynamics, is so important, but also why it must be incredibly hard to actually do.
Absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head. There are some really common, deeply ingrained obstacles.
Like what?
Guilt and obligation are huge,
Yeah.
stemming from cultural ideas, family expectations about loyalty, always putting the family first, even if it harms you.
Yeah, that pressure is real.
Then there's fear of confrontation, just dreading the argument, the backlash, the uncomfortable feelings, so people avoid it.
Makes sense.
And also, sometimes just this persistent hope for change. You keep thinking maybe this time they'll understand or maybe they'll change. So setting a boundary feels premature or even mean.
Right, holding out hope.
Exactly. And if there's that long history of enmeshment we talked about, those patterns just feel so normal, even if they're harmful. Breaking free feels almost impossible, like navigating without a map.
Okay, so we've really unpacked the why boundaries matter, why it's so tough. Let's shift now to the how. What are some really concrete strategies for setting and maintaining boundaries, especially when cutting contact isn't the goal or isn't possible?
Right. The absolute first thing, the most crucial shift in thinking, emphasized everywhere from Reddit to the expert sources, is this. Setting boundaries is about controlling your actions and your responses.
Ah, okay. Not about trying to force them to change.
Exactly. Because you can't, ultimately. You can only control yourself.
That's a really key mindset shift.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the actionable steps?
First, you really need to identify your boundaries. Seriously, take some time for honest reflection. What are your core values? What do you actually need in these relationships? What specific behaviors just feel unacceptable or harmful to you?
Okay.
And pay attention to your feelings, that nagging guilt, the resentment that keeps bubbling up, feeling unappreciated. Those are often huge clues that a boundary is being crossed or needs to be set.
Right, those feelings are signals. Got it. So identify them first, then what?
Then, the next step is to communicate them assertively, clearly, firmly, but also respectfully. Using I statements is usually much more effective.
Can you give an example?
Sure, so instead of saying, "You always criticize my choices," which sounds like an attack.
Yeah, puts them on the defensive.
Exactly. Try something like, "I feel hurt and unsupported when my choices are criticized. What I need is to feel respected in my decisions." See, it focuses on your experience and your need.
That feels much less confrontational. Yeah. More about expressing yourself.
Precisely. And another good tip, especially if this is new for you, is to start small. Don't try to fix everything overnight. Pick one specific area, one boundary, and focus your energy there first.
Okay, don't bite off more than you can chew.
Right. And there was this interesting method mentioned on Reddit, the ask, tell, make approach.
Ask, tell, make. Okay, what's that?
First, you calmly ask the person to change the behavior. "Could you please not interrupt me?" If they don't respect that, you tell them the boundary and the consequence. "I need to finish my thoughts. If I continue to be interrupted, I'll need to end the conversation."
Okay.
And then this is the critical part. You make them respect it by actually enforcing the consequence every single time.
That last step, the enforcement, that sounds like the really hard part.
It absolutely is. Because setting a boundary without enforcing it, it just feels like a suggestion to the other person. You have to follow through.
Right.
If you say you'll leave if they yell, you have to leave when they yell. Inconsistency just weakens the boundary. It tells them they don't really need to take it seriously because you might give in next time.
So what are some practical examples? How do people actually enforce these things in the moment?
There are quite a few ways. Really depends on the situation. Like if someone keeps interrupting after you've asked them to stop, you could say, "Please stop." If it continues, maybe, "Okay, I'm going to step away now," and then physically leave the room or end the call. That's enforcing it.
Okay.
Or maybe you choose to ignore certain behaviors, especially if they feel attention-seeking. If someone keeps showing up unannounced after you've asked them to call,
Yeah.
your consequence might be just not answering the door
Oh, okay.
or limiting time spent together. Using gray rocking, becoming really boring and emotionally unresponsive when they try to provoke you.
Gray rocking, like being a gray rock.
Exactly. You give minimal, unemotional responses. Makes you less interesting to engage with in that negative way. The key is deciding the consequence beforehand, making sure it's something you can and will do, and then doing it consistently.
It sounds like you definitely need to brace yourself for some pushback, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. Expect it. It's really important. When you change the rules of the relationship, especially if someone benefited from the old rules,
Yeah.
they're likely to test the new limits. You might get guilt trips, anger. Maybe they even escalate things to try and get you to back down.
So what do you do then?
You have to stay consistent, even when it's hard. Giving in just once sends the message that the boundary isn't firm. It undermines all your previous efforts.
Okay. But what if the boundary crossing is really constant or feels really intense, even with your best efforts?
In those tougher situations, limiting contact might become necessary to protect yourself, even if cutting them off completely isn't the plan.
So like seeing them less often.
Yeah, maybe shifting from weekly visits to monthly calls, or keeping interaction shorter. You always have control over how much access someone has to you, to your energy.
That's empowering to remember.
It is, and it's also really important to recognize they might not change. You might do everything right, and they still might not respect your boundaries.
So then what?
Then your focus has to shift purely to managing the situation for your safety and well-being. Self-protection becomes the priority.
This all sounds like it takes a lot of emotional energy. What about support?
Crucial, absolutely essential. Prioritizing self-care isn't selfish, it's necessary fuel. Nurture yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, whatever recharges you.
Okay.
And definitely seek support. Talk to trusted friends, maybe other family members who get it. And therapy can be incredibly helpful.
How so?
A therapist provides that safe space to process everything, develop coping strategies, build resilience, and just get guidance navigating these really complex dynamics.
We focused a lot on the here and now, the relationship dynamics.
Yeah.
But one of the sources mentioned the longer-term impact,
Yeah.
especially of toxic parenting on kids. Can you touch on that?
Yes, that's such an important layer. The research highlights that when parents consistently fail to meet a child's basic needs, physical, emotional, psychological, and routinely ignore their boundaries,
Yeah.
it can really inhibit healthy growth. It can lead to actual psychological injuries, even trauma, with effects that last a long time.
Wow.
And sadly, these patterns can become intergenerational. Kids raised in these environments might unknowingly repeat the same patterns in their own relationships with their own kids.
So breaking the cycle is key.
It really is. These patterns often run deep, kind of like invisible scripts we follow without realizing it. Recognizing them is the first step to rewriting them.
It just really underscores how vital this boundary work is.
Absolutely. And it circles back to that core idea. Setting boundaries, as tough as it feels sometimes, is fundamentally an act of self-preservation,
Yeah.
self-respect. It is not selfish to prioritize your well-being, to define how you want to be treated. It's about reclaiming your identity, your autonomy, making sure you get the basic respect and kindness everyone deserves, especially from family.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final thought you want to leave people with? Something to mull over.
Okay, consider this. What's just one small, manageable step you could realistically take this week, maybe even today,
Okay.
to either identify a boundary you need or maybe communicate one you already know about more clearly? Just one small thing. And then think about how even that tiny shift might start to impact your interactions, your peace of mind.
That's a really powerful, practical takeaway. Thank you so much for digging into this with me today. I really hope this has given you, our listeners, some valuable insights and maybe some concrete strategies to think about.
Yeah, and we really encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, reflect on your own relationships. And please, if you're facing really significant challenges, remember that seeking professional support therapy, support groups, can be an incredibly helpful and empowering step.
Absolutely. Ultimately, remember that healthier family relationships are possible. And learning to set and maintain healthy boundaries, that's often a crucial and really courageous first step on that path.